The wind moves across the Summer Lake Basin in Lake County, in south-central Oregon, where the sagebrush runs to the horizon and a low shelf of limestone breaks the flat of the high desert. Beneath that overhang, in the dry dust of a cave floor, a gloved hand lifts a small, unremarkable lump of hardened material. It is not a spear point. It is not a carved bead or a fragment of bone. It is dried human waste, a coprolite. And it has been sealed in the arid sediment of these caves for more than 14,000 years. That single scrap is about to break a rule that stood for most of a century. Radiocarbon dating will place it at roughly 14,300 years old, which means a person crouched in this shelter more than 1,000 years before the culture the textbooks called the first Americans. The least glamorous object in all of archaeology is going to rewrite the timeline. And it will do it not with a weapon or a monument, but with the oldest directly dated trace of a human body ever found in the Western Hemisphere. The site has a plain name: the Paisley 5 Mile Point Caves, a cluster of shallow rock shelters north of the small town of Paisley, in the northern Great Basin. They are not grand. Each is little more than a wind-cut hollow in a ridge of volcanic rock, overlooking a basin that once held a far larger lake at the end of the last ice age. To a family moving across that landscape thousands of years ago, the shelters would have looked like exactly what they were: a dry place to stop, out of the wind, near water and game. They first drew scientific attention in the 1930s, when Luther Cressman of the University of Oregon dug here and suspected the shelters were old. He could not prove how old. The tools of his era could not reach that far back. The proof would come from a different generation. In the 2000s, Dennis L. Jenkins, a senior archaeologist with the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History, reopened the caves and began the slow, patient work of excavation. His team sifted silt, mapped every layer by hand, and recovered the coprolites that would make the site famous. They sent them for accelerator mass spectrometry radiocarbon dating, a method that measures the decay of carbon-14 in organic material to determine its age. The oldest specimens return dates as far back as 14,300 years, calibrated to roughly 14,400 calendar years before the present. Jenkins reported the findings in the journal Science in May of 2008. To understand why that number mattered, you have to understand the rule it broke. For most of the 20th century, the story of the first Americans was settled. People crossed a land bridge from Siberia at the end of the last ice age, carrying a distinctive fluted stone spear point first found near Clovis, New Mexico. The Clovis people were the first, arriving around 11,500 radiocarbon years ago. That idea was so dominant it had a name of its own: Clovis First. And it came with an unspoken warning: claim a site older than Clovis, and be ready to defend it against the entire field. That was the wall. Paisley stood 1,000 years on the wrong side of it. What made the caves so valuable was also what made them so contested. The evidence was not a skeleton. It was organic waste, preserved by the extreme dryness of the shelters, and inside that waste was human mitochondrial DNA. The lineages recovered belonged to haplogroups A and B, the maternal signatures carried by living Native Americans and traceable back to Siberia and East Asia. The coprolites lay in stratified silt, roughly 2 meters down, alongside the bones of extinct camel and horse, and the remains of a small rock-lined hearth. This was not a random scatter. It looked like a place where people had lived, cooked, and returned. The team did not rely on a single date. Across the excavations, they gathered nearly 190 radiocarbon dates from the deposits, and those dates fell in clean chronological order. Oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top. The layers had not been churned, but the first reaction from much of the field was not acceptance. It was a specific and reasonable fear. A dry cave, worked over by rodents and rats for millennia, is exactly the kind of place where younger material might wash or burrow downward and contaminate older layers. A coprolite is not a bone locked in a grave. The very thing that made it dateable also made it suspect. Paisley was never meant to stand alone. To see why the date held, you have to leave the cave and look at what the rest of the continent was quietly saying at the same time. The first corroboration came from stone. Among the artifacts at Paisley and at related sites was a tool-making tradition that did not match Clovis at all. It is called the Western stem tradition, and its points are not fluted the way Clovis points are. They are worked to a narrowed base, a stem, and they belong to a fundamentally different way of shaping stone. For decades, the assumption was that Western stem technology came after Clovis, a later development. At Paisley, that assumption fell apart. Western stem points appeared in layers as old as Clovis, or older. Downriver, in western Idaho, the site of Cooper's Ferry pushed occupation back past 16,000 years, again with no Clovis toolkit at the base. This matters on its own. If a non-Clovis technology existed as early as Clovis, or earlier, then Clovis was never the mother culture from which everything descended. Two traditions overlapped in time, and may have developed along separate paths entirely. The single origin story breaks on the strength of the stone alone, without anyone needing to open a coprolite. But that is only part of it. Stone tells you a technology was present. It does not tell you who carried it, or where they came from. For that, you have to read something written inside the body itself. That is where the second line of evidence comes in. The mitochondrial DNA recovered from the coprolites was not a modern smear or a European contaminant. It was maternal lineage, haplogroups A and B, the exact founding signatures of the Native American population, rooted in Northeast Asia. These are the lineages that mark the deep ancestry of indigenous peoples across both American continents, passed down mother to child in an unbroken line for tens of thousands of years. Independent laboratories repeated the identifications, rather than taking a single result on faith. And here is where it gets specific. DNA cannot be radiocarbon dated directly, but when the biological signal and the physical date agree, and when the lineages match the known first peoples of the Americas, rather than anything recent or European, the easy dismissal of modern contamination becomes very hard to hold. Two disciplines now pointed the same way. The third piece did not come from a spear point or a strand of DNA. It came from chemistry, and it arrived 12 years after the first announcement. In a 2020 study published in Science Advances, researchers analyzed the fecal lipid biomarkers preserved in the coprolites, the fat molecules that identify the host species chemically, without depending on mobile DNA at all. The logic was elegant. DNA can move through wet sediment, but the specific lipid profile of human waste behaves differently and is far harder to explain away as contamination. 3 pre-Clovis coprolites came back unequivocally human. A directly dated basketry fragment near 14,000 years old, and detailed stratigraphic work by Thomas Connolly of the same museum reinforced that the layers were intact and that a genuine cultural artifact sat in pre-Clovis soil. 3 separate clocks in 3 separate disciplines, returning one date. If you follow this channel because you want the story where a single overlooked artifact quietly dismantles a textbook, this is exactly the kind of case we dig into, site by site and date by date, showing the evidence rather than the headline. Subscribing is the simplest way to catch the next one the week it goes up. That decade of confirmation did not come easily, and the man who spent it under fire is the reason this story is about people and not just carbon. Dennis Jenkins did not receive quiet acceptance when he published in 2008. He received a formal rebuttal. In 2009, Hendrik Poinar of the McMaster Ancient DNA Center and his colleagues published a comment in the journal Science, questioning the authenticity of the DNA and the reliability of the oldest dates. It was a serious challenge from serious scientists, not a fringe complaint. And in a field where a pre-Clovis claim invites the full weight of scrutiny, it could have buried the site. For a lesser response, it might have. Many pre-Clovis claims before Paisley had been raised, doubted, and quietly abandoned when their authors could not answer the criticism. Jenkins did not retreat. He did something unusual. He invited the skeptics to the cave. In the autumn of 2009, he hosted an archaeological summit at Paisley, bringing critics to the site itself and walking them through the stratigraphy in person, layer by layer, letting them see the sealed deposits with their own eyes. He persuaded several of them on the spot. Then he went back to the ground. From 2009 through 2011, his team excavated further, adding hundreds of radiocarbon dates and recovering the western stem points that deepened the case. The follow-up appeared in Science in 2012, and the Lipid Biomarkers study followed in 2020. Piece by piece, year by year, the field came around. Paisley is now widely regarded as one of the earliest well-accepted human sites in the Americas, and the Coprolites as the oldest directly dated human remains in the Western Hemisphere. He earned the vindication by inviting the doubt in rather than shutting it out. That distinction matters, because it is the opposite of how these stories usually go. It would be easy to end there, with the critics won over and the skeptic cast as the obstacle. But honest history means giving the other side its strongest form, because for years that side had a real case. Clovis first was not stubbornness, for its own sake. For most of the 20th century, Clovis points were the oldest securely dated, widely replicated evidence on the continent, found again and again across North America, and tied to a plausible route down an ice-free corridor between the melting glaciers. The principle behind the resistance is sound. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and a single dry cave riddled with rodent burrows is a genuinely difficult place to prove anything at all. A responsible field should have pushed back. It would have been a failure of science not to. The specific objection was leaching. Poinar and his colleagues argued that without intact stratigraphy and diagnostic stone tools, and given carbon isotope anomalies in the oldest samples, younger human DNA could have migrated down through the sediment into older, non-human coprolites, making the dates appear far older than the human signal really was. A separate critique questioned whether the oldest specimen was even human, suggesting it more closely resembled the waist of an animal, perhaps a camel. These were not unreasonable points. They were the field doing its job. But there is one detail the contamination explanation cannot fully absorb. If water were carrying younger material downward through the deposit, the soluble fraction of a sample should read younger than the coprolite around it. In the great majority of paired tests, the soluble material came back the same age or older. That is the opposite of what leaching would produce. And lipid chemistry, which does not travel through sediment the way loose DNA does, still returns human. Take the stone, the genes, and the chemistry together, and the argument stops being about one cave. Archaeology places a non-Clovis tool tradition in the region as early as Clovis or earlier. Genetics places founding population maternal lineages in the oldest layers. Chemistry confirms the coprolites are human and directly dates them. 3 independent lines, from 3 different fields, all placing people in Oregon before Clovis existed. No single line has to carry the weight alone, and that is precisely why the site held where others crumbled. What it means for the timeline is straightforward. Clovis was not the beginning. It was a chapter partway through a much longer story. Paisley does not stand as a lone anomaly either. It sits inside a growing set of pre-Clovis sites, from Cooper's Ferry in Idaho to Monte Verde in southern Chile, that together retired Clovis first as the default model of how the Americas were peopled. The wall came down, and Paisley was one of the stones that pushed it over. But there is a boundary this evidence does not cross, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Paisley proves that people were in Oregon before Clovis. It does not prove they were the first Americans, and it does not tell us what to call them. The oldest layers left behind human waste, human DNA, and human chemistry, but no diagnostic stone toolkit that would tie those earliest occupants to a named culture. Who they were, the language they spoke, the route they walked or paddled to get here, all of it remains open. That missing toolkit is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a real gap in real sediment that no one has yet filled. The deeper deposits within the Paisley caves and the wider Summer Lake Basin that surrounds them remain only partially excavated. The sediments that could hold the missing tools, the artifacts that would finally give these people a technological identity, are still in the ground, undug and unread. The reason is not mystery or suppression. It is the slow arithmetic of the work itself. Excavation in a fragile, federally managed cave system moves at the pace of permits and funding cycles, and each season reaches only a little deeper than the last. The people who left the Coprolites are, for now, anonymous. The layers that would tell us who they were are still down there, sealed in the dry sediment of the Summer Lake Basin, waiting for a trowel that has not yet reached them.